Let me tell you about a man who fought World War II for 29 years after it ended. Yes, you heard that right. 29 years. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and his story is one of the most extraordinary tales of loyalty, survival, and the human spirit you'll ever hear. Picture this. It's March 1974. A young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki is wandering through the jungles of Lubang Island in the Philippines. He's not there for tourism or research. He's looking for three things: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. Two of these are mythical creatures, and one is a Japanese soldier who supposedly never stopped fighting World War II. Suzuki finds Onoda, and that's where our story truly begins to unravel. But we need to go back to understand how a soldier could spend nearly 3 decades in the jungle, fighting a war that ended before he even knew it had begun. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. Growing up in the 1930s and early 1940s meant growing up in a Japan that was increasingly militaristic and at war. When Onoda was 20 years old, he was called up to join the Imperial Japanese Army. This wasn't unusual. Many young men were being drafted as World War II intensified. What made Onoda different was his selection for special training. He was sent to the Nakano School, an elite intelligence academy where soldiers learned guerrilla warfare, survival skills, sabotage, and espionage. The training was intense and thorough. Students learned how to survive on almost nothing, how to gather intelligence, and most importantly, how to never surrender. The instructors at Nakano drilled one message into their students above all others: never give up, never surrender. Your mission comes first, always. For Onoda, these words would become more than instructions. They would become his entire existence. In December 1944, Onoda received his orders. He was to go to Lubang Island, a small island in the Philippines, and conduct guerrilla warfare. His mission was clear: hamper enemy attacks on the island, and do whatever it takes to support Japanese troops. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him specific instructions that would echo in his mind for decades. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. There was one more crucial order. Under no circumstances was Onoda allowed to take his own life. Suicide was not an option. He was to survive and continue his mission no matter what. When Onoda arrived on Lubang Island with several other soldiers, the situation was already deteriorating for Japanese forces. Allied troops were pushing through the Pacific, and Japan was losing ground everywhere. But Onoda and his small group prepared themselves for a long campaign. They gathered supplies, scouted the terrain, and made plans to carry out their guerrilla operations. Then, in February 1945, American forces invaded Lubang Island. The battle was swift and decisive. Most Japanese soldiers were killed or captured, but Onoda and a handful of others escaped into the dense jungle of the island's interior. They would wait there, watching, planning their next move. What none of them knew was that on August 15, 1945, just 6 months after they went into hiding, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. Within months of the war's end, the Allied forces began dropping leaflets over the Philippine jungles. These leaflets, written in Japanese, had a simple message: the war is over. Japan has surrendered. Come out and you will be safely repatriated. Onoda and his companions found these leaflets. They read them carefully, and then they dismissed them as enemy propaganda. This might seem foolish to us now, but put yourself in their shoes. They had been trained at an elite school that specifically warned them about enemy psychological warfare. They had been told that the enemy would use every trick to make them surrender. The leaflets looked suspicious. The printing quality wasn't quite right. Some of the Japanese characters seemed off. Surely this was just another enemy trick. So they stayed in the jungle, and they continued their mission. As months turned into years, Onoda's group grew smaller. One soldier surrendered in 1950. Another was killed in 1954 during a clash with local police. By 1972, only Onoda and one companion, Private Teruo Nakamura, remained. Then Nakamura was killed in a firefight with Filipino police. Onoda was alone, but his mission continued. For 29 years, Onoda lived in the mountains and jungles of Lubang Island. His daily life was a constant struggle for survival combined with what he saw as his military duty. He moved camp regularly, never staying in one place too long. He rationed the few supplies he had. When his uniform wore out, he patched it. When his boots fell apart, he made new ones from tree bark. Food was a constant challenge. Onoda survived on coconuts, bananas, and whatever small animals he could catch or kill. He avoided the lowland areas where Filipino farmers lived, but occasionally he would raid farms for rice or shoot a cow for meat. To the local population, these weren't acts of war, they were crimes. They called him a bandit and a murderer. From Onoda's perspective, he was still at war. Every Filipino civilian was a potential enemy combatant. Every policeman searching for him was an enemy soldier. When he shot at people, he believed he was engaging hostile forces. When he burned rice stores, he thought he was disrupting enemy supply lines. Over the years, the Japanese government made numerous attempts to convince Onoda that the war had ended. They dropped more leaflets. They sent search parties. They even had his family members come to Lubang to broadcast messages over loudspeakers, begging him to come home. Onoda heard these messages. He heard his own brother's voice calling to him, but he remained convinced it was all an elaborate trick. How could he know for certain? He had no radio, no contact with the outside world except what he could observe from hiding. And what he observed seemed to confirm his suspicions. There were American-made military vehicles on the island. There were soldiers. How could the war be over if enemy forces still occupied Philippine territory? By the 1970s, Hiroo Onoda had become a legend in Japan. Stories of the soldier who wouldn't surrender captured the public imagination. Some saw him as a hero, embodying the samurai spirit of loyalty and duty. Others saw him as a tragic figure, trapped by outdated orders and an inability to accept reality. Norio Suzuki was a young Japanese adventurer who decided he wanted to find three things before he settled down: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Onoda. The first two proved elusive, but in February 1974, Suzuki actually found Onoda in the Lubang jungle. The meeting was surreal. Here was this young man from modern Japan, wearing contemporary clothes, speaking casually, meeting a man who still thought it was 1945. They talked for days. Suzuki explained that the war had ended decades ago. Japan had been rebuilt. It was now a prosperous, peaceful nation. Onoda listened politely, but remained unmoved. He told Suzuki something that would become famous. He would only surrender if his commanding officer came and gave him a direct order to stand down. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs proving he had found Onoda. The Japanese government quickly located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer, who was now living as a civilian bookseller. They asked if he would be willing to travel to the Philippines. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi walked into the Lubang jungle in his old uniform. There, he met Lieutenant Onoda for the first time in nearly 30 years. Taniguchi gave Onoda official orders. The war is over. You are relieved of your duties. You are ordered to cease all military activities and surrender. Finally, Onoda accepted it. His war was over. When Hiroo Onoda emerged from the jungle and formally surrendered to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, he was still in his tattered uniform, still carrying his sword, and still had his rifle in working condition. He stood at attention and handed over his weapon with military precision. The world watched in amazement. Here was a man who had single-handedly continued fighting for 29 years. During that time, he had engaged in over 100 firefights. Nearly 30 people had been killed or wounded in encounters with him. The Philippine government considered charging Onoda with murder. Local residents were angry. They had lost friends and family members to this Japanese soldier. But President Marcos understood the unique circumstances and pardoned Onoda, saying that for him, the war had never ended. When Onoda returned to Japan, he received a hero's welcome. Thousands of people greeted him at the airport. The media coverage was overwhelming, but Onoda struggled with what he found. This wasn't the Japan he had left behind in 1944. Everything had changed. The country he had fought for no longer existed. The values he had lived by seemed outdated. Young people were carefree and materialistic. Nobody talked about duty or loyalty anymore. Onoda felt like a man out of time, and in many ways, he was. He had lived through 29 years without experiencing any of them. He had missed the entire post-war period, Japan's reconstruction, the economic miracle, the cultural shifts of the 1960s. Onoda struggled to adjust. After a few years in Japan, he moved to Brazil, where he bought a cattle ranch. The wide open spaces and simpler lifestyle suited him better than modern Tokyo. He married and settled into a quieter life, far from the attention and expectations. But Onoda never forgot his time on Lubang Island. In 1996, he did something remarkable. He returned to Lubang and donated $10,000 to the local school. He wanted to make amends, in some way, for the pain his presence had caused. He continued to visit the island and eventually set up a foundation to support educational initiatives there. In his later years, Onoda wrote about his experiences and spoke about survival, determination, and loyalty. Some people asked if he regretted those 29 years. Onoda's answer was complex. He didn't regret following his orders or staying loyal to his mission, but he acknowledged that the world had moved on while he had not. Hiroo Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91. He had lived almost as many years in the modern world as he had spent in the jungle, but those 29 years on Lubang Island defined him and his legacy. The story of Hiroo Onoda forces us to think about loyalty, duty, and the price of both. Here was a man so committed to his orders that he gave up nearly 3 decades of his life. He missed watching his family grow. He missed falling in love, starting a career, experiencing peace. He lived every single day in survival mode, carrying out a mission that had long since become irrelevant. Today, when we think about Hiroo Onoda, we should remember him not just as the soldier who wouldn't surrender, but as a human being who tried his best to do what he thought was right with the information he had. His story is ultimately about what happens when the world changes, but one person cannot. And in the end, it's about finding the courage to finally accept that change and move forward, even after 29 years of standing still.